Well, welcome to week 20 of the story. We are almost finished with the Old Testament. Next week, week 21, we'll finish the Old Testament, and then in 2 weeks, in week 22, we start the New Testament. It's been a great journey so far. Remember, the goal of the story has been to show us how from the very start, the upper story of God's Word is about what He's doing to win us back to Himself. Each week we've considered a person, an event, a place where God teaches us in the lower story about what He's doing in the upper story to win us back to Himself. Well, tonight we come to a great story, but a little background. Through the years and even recently, some have tried to downplay the role of women in the Scripture. Some would make them second class in God's kingdom. Some would not allow women any place of leadership within the church. Some would limit the role of women when Christ and the writers of the New Testament greatly expanded the role, the importance, and the view of women in the church. This evening, our lesson comes from a woman. It's a fascinating story, and one that I think certainly fits this time in our lives. The woman's name is Esther. Let's see what we can learn. Well, a little bit of background on Esther. Esther was her Persian name. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. She was an orphan from the tribe of Benjamin. She lived among the Jewish exiles in Persia. She was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who served as a minor governmental official. A king by the name of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, was the leader of the Persian Empire. This most likely places this story approximately 500 years before the birth of Christ. The story simply begins with a simple story, an event, a king holding a banquet. King Xerxes of Persia had just spent 6 months parading his wealth before the entire kingdom. It took that long. And now he's throwing a feast for all the men in the capital city for 7 days. His queen, Vashti, was giving a banquet for the women at the same time. After 7 days of drinking, the king orders the queen to come and parade herself before his drunken guests. Queen Vashti refuses to come. This made the king furious. And seeing his anger, the king's personal attendants came up with an idea. They suggested that the king should issue a royal decree declaring that Vashti was never to again to come into his presence. They also encouraged him to make someone else his queen. They said, let's find as many beautiful young virgins as we can for the king, then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Now that advice obviously appealed to King Xerxes, and the search began. Well, in the city there was a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem. Mordecai had a beautiful cousin named Esther, whom he had raised because she had neither mother nor father. When the king's edict was announced, many of the girls, including Esther, were brought to the king's palace. Kind of an early version of the TV show The Bachelor. Esther didn't tell anyone that she was a Jew because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth near the courtyard where the harem was kept to find out how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. The king was attracted to Esther more than any other of women, and he eventually made Esther his queen. While Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, he overheard 2 of the king's officers plotting to kill King Xerxes. He told Queen Esther about the plot, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were put to death. Now, during this time, King Xerxes honored a man named Haman. Now, you're familiar with the story. Elating him to a place of high honor in the kingdom. The king commanded all royal officials to kneel down and pay honor to Haman because of his position. But Mordecai refused to kneel down. Remind you of any other Jewish young men? Yeah, Daniel. Haman was so angry that he looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews. Throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, he wanted to destroy them. Because of Haman's influence, King Xerxes listened to him, and an order went out to kill all the Jews. Now listen to the rest of the story. It's found in Esther chapter 4. It goes like this. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Then Esther called for Hattach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was. Hattach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, and that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and to plead with him on behalf of her people. What Hattach went and told Esther, and Hattach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hattach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he might live. But as for me, I've not been called to come into the king's presence these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink anything for 3 days and nights. I and my young women will fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Wow, what a story. Well, what are some principles for us? Well, let me quickly share some. First, the Lord does not shield us from difficult situations. Esther may have felt somewhat trapped, her uncle demanding one action, and to do so might mean her death. It was a difficult situation, and the only solution involved her taking a risk. Now, some would have you believe that Christians never face difficult times, or when they do, it's a result of a lack of faith. So many people lose heart because they bought into that lie. Tough, difficult times come to all of us. It's part of living in a fallen world. In Esther's story, she risked losing her privileged position, her possessions, her status, even her life. But she accomplished what God wanted. For people of faith, our lives have a divine purpose. That's the second reason. Second thing we can learn. First, the Lord doesn't shield us from difficult situations. Second, for people of faith, our lives have a divine purpose. God placed Esther in Persia, in Mordecai's care, in the king's house, for such a time as this. It's not a fatalistic view of what will be, but rather it's the Lord placing His people in places where they can have the greatest impact for Him. Esther had the king's favor and access to the king. No other Jew could do what Esther could do. Third, when you're in those times, it's important to enlist the support and prayers of others when you're trying to do God's will. Remember what Esther did? She asked her uncle and all the Jews in the town to pray and fast for 3 days on her behalf. She would do the same, and then she would go to the king. The strength that comes from others is seen in her resolve. If I perish, I perish. Well, as we try to apply this to our lives, at times we all feel trapped in a difficult situation. Maybe you're a single parent with bills to pay and no income or support. A job that keeps you away from family way too much. Being out of work or underemployed. Stress and pressure. Practices that make you question and cringe at work when you have to compromise who you're supposed to be. Personal situations that need to be addressed, but you're fearful. It's good to know that the Lord does not shield us from adversity or difficult situations or hard times or tough decisions. Your situation is not necessarily the result of a lack of faith or being disciplined by God. Now, there are consequences for sinful behavior to both Christians and to those who don't know Christ at all. The Lord may have you in a particular situation to prepare you for the future and to build your character and witness. You see, for a sculptor to turn a piece of rock into a statue, there are many blows with a hammer, with a chisel. There are rough edges that need to be sanded off. Being shaped by the Lord, I think, is a similar process. When you feel pressure and you feel trapped, look to see what the Lord might be doing in your life. It's important for you to remember that the Lord has you where you are for a purpose. Your life has a divine purpose. You are here not by accident, but by design. Then how do you invest yourself? Knowing that the Lord has placed you where you are makes a difference. And what a difference you are to make where you are. Rather than always looking for greener pastures in different places, Irma Bombeck, remember, said, grass is always greener over the septic tank. Seek ways to be used by God where you are. It might be for just a time as this. When you feel alone or abandoned or weak, enlist the support and prayers of others when you're trying to do God's will. The support of friends is important. Remember, Jesus sent His disciples out 2 by 2. He knew if they went out by themselves, they'd wimp out, but together they were strong. When others pray, they bring to bear on your life the power of God in your life and situation. Let me leave you with this. Truths from Esther's life. The Lord does not shield us from difficult situations. For people of faith, our lives have divine purpose. Enlist the support and prayers of others when you're trying to do God's will. Make a difference where you are. And that's a story worth knowing and telling.